Karoline Leavitt settled into her seat on the plane, adjusting the small silver cross around her neck. It was a simple symbol of her faith, something she had worn for years without much thought. But today, it would become the center of an unexpected confrontation. The flight was already boarding, passengers moving through the narrow aisles, stuffing bags into overhead compartments, and settling into their seats. The air buzzed with the usual pre-flight chaos, stewards directing people, families trying to find their places, and last-minute phone calls before takeoff. Karoline, a frequent traveler, barely noticed the noise around her. She had flown countless times and knew the routine well. Then, as she glanced up, she saw a flight attendant making her way down the aisle, greeting passengers with a tight-lipped smile. Something about her demeanor was off. Instead of the usual welcoming attitude, there was an edge to her movements, a sharpness in her eyes as she scanned the rows. Karoline didn't pay much attention until the woman stopped at her row, her gaze lingering a little too long. She could feel the woman's eyes settle on her neck, the small cross resting just below her collarbone. There was a brief pause, a flicker of something in the attendant's expression. Disapproval, irritation, something Karoline couldn't quite place. Then, in a voice that was just a little too firm, the woman spoke. "Ma'am, is there a reason you're wearing that?" Karoline blinked, caught off guard by the question. At first, she thought she had misheard. "Excuse me?" The flight attendant's lips pressed together. "Your necklace, the cross." Her tone was clipped, her posture rigid. Karoline instinctively reached up, fingers brushing against the pendant. "Yes," she said simply, her voice calm. "It's my faith." The woman's expression darkened. "You do realize that not everyone on this flight shares your beliefs, right?" The statement hung in the air, absurd in its implication. Around them, other passengers began to take notice. A man across the aisle glanced over. A mother with her child nearby paused as she buckled her seatbelt. Karoline kept her composure, refusing to let emotion take over. "I'm aware," she replied evenly, "but I don't see how that's an issue." The flight attendant exhaled sharply, her frustration evident. "It's about being considerate. Some people might find that offensive." Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying the woman. "Offensive?" she echoed, her voice still measured. "How exactly does a cross offend someone?" The woman shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. "Symbols like that can make others feel excluded," she insisted. "We try to create a welcoming environment for all passengers." Karoline couldn't help but marvel at the irony. A cross, a symbol of love, sacrifice, and faith, was being framed as a divisive emblem. She had seen moments like this play out in news stories, had heard accounts of people being pressured to hide their beliefs in the name of inclusivity, but now, experiencing it firsthand, she was struck by how blatant the double standard had become. She could have chosen to stay silent, to brush off the confrontation and let it pass. But that wasn't who she was. She believed in standing firm, in not allowing herself to be intimidated by misplaced outrage. "I appreciate that you want to create a welcoming space," she said, her voice steady, "but I fail to see how my necklace disrupts that. It's a personal expression, nothing more." The flight attendant's jaw tightened. "Well, some passengers might disagree." Karoline met her gaze, unflinching. "If someone has a problem with my cross, that's their issue, not mine." A small murmur rippled through the surrounding seats. People were watching now, some nodding subtly in agreement. The flight attendant seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Her authority, which she had assumed would be absolute, was suddenly in question. She hesitated, then pursed her lips. "Just be mindful," she muttered, before turning on her heel and moving further down the aisle. Karoline exhaled slowly, watching her go. The confrontation had been brief, but it spoke volumes. In an age where people preached tolerance, that tolerance often seemed to have limits, especially when it came to faith. but she wasn't about to apologize for who she was or what she believed. As the final passengers boarded and the flight crew prepared for takeoff, she settled back into her seat, the small silver cross still resting against her skin, exactly where it belonged. Karoline took a steady breath, keeping her posture relaxed as she watched the flight attendant walk away. The tension still lingered in the air, but she refused to let it shake her. This wasn't the first time she had faced something like this, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But she knew one thing for certain: she would not be intimidated. She glanced down at the small silver cross resting just below her collarbone. It was a part of her, a quiet but unwavering statement of who she was and what she believed. She had never worn it to provoke, never flaunted it as a challenge to anyone else's beliefs. It was simply an expression of faith, as natural to her as breathing. And yet, somehow, that small symbol had drawn ire. The flight attendant's words echoed in her mind. "You do realize not everyone on this flight shares your beliefs, right?" The absurdity of it made her stomach tighten. Since when did personal faith require approval from strangers? Since when did expressing belief become something offensive? A middle-aged man sitting across the aisle leaned forward slightly, giving her a nod. It was subtle, but she could see the silent support in his eyes. A woman a few rows ahead turned her head, glancing between Karoline and the flight attendant now tending to another passenger. Others had noticed. Karoline exhaled slowly, then turned to the woman seated next to her, who had been quiet during the exchange but was clearly aware of what had happened. She was an older woman, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap. She gave Karoline a small smile. "That was something, wasn't it?" the woman murmured, her voice just low enough for Karoline to hear. Karoline let out a soft chuckle, though there was little humor in it. "It was." The woman's gaze flickered to the cross around Karoline's neck. "I think it's lovely," she said simply. "Thank you," Karoline replied, offering a warm smile. The woman hesitated, then added, "It's strange, isn't it? How some people preach tolerance but have no patience for faith." Karoline nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I've noticed that tolerance seems to have conditions these days. It's welcome, until it's something they disagree with." The woman hummed in agreement. "A selective kind of acceptance." Karoline tilted her head, glancing down at the cross once more before looking back toward the flight attendant, who was now chatting with a passenger a few rows ahead. The woman's body language had shifted. She was stiff, shoulders squared as if still carrying tension from their exchange. It was clear she hadn't expected pushback. But Karoline hadn't responded with anger or aggression. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. Instead, she had spoken calmly, refusing to be bullied into silence. She had learned long ago that in moments like this, composure was everything. Anger was easy. Righteous indignation could be justified. But it rarely changed minds. People expected confrontation, but what unsettled them was unwavering confidence, a quiet strength that refused to yield. A few moments later, the flight attendant made her way back down the aisle. Karoline noticed the slight hesitation in her step as she approached. She was avoiding direct eye contact, her expression neutral but tight. It was clear she was trying to gauge the atmosphere, trying to see whether the other passengers had moved on from the brief but notable exchange. Karoline didn't flinch as the woman stopped near her row again, this time pretending to check the overhead compartments. It was an unnecessary action. Everything had been secured. But it was obvious she was stalling, lingering near Karoline as if deciding whether or not to say something else. Finally, she spoke, her tone noticeably softer than before. "Can I get you anything to drink?" It wasn't an apology, not directly. But Karoline could hear the shift, the slight uncertainty in her voice. She met the woman's gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she gave a polite smile. "Just water, please." The flight attendant nodded quickly, almost relieved, before moving on. Karoline watched her go, feeling the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just about her cross. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about something bigger, the quiet but persistent push against open expressions of faith, the unspoken expectation that believers should shrink themselves to avoid making others uncomfortable. But she wouldn't shrink. She wouldn't apologize, and she certainly wouldn't take off her cross just because someone else disapproved. The energy in the cabin had shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. Passengers who had been focused on their own business, the ones scrolling through their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, or adjusting their carry-ons, were now glancing up, exchanging quick looks, whispering to their seatmates. It was the kind of shift that happens when something unexpected unfolds in a space where people are usually just trying to get through the next few hours without any disturbances. Karoline remained composed, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. But inside, she was keenly aware of the ripple effect of the interaction. The flight attendant had expected her to shrink back, to comply, to lower her head and accept the unspoken demand. Instead, she had done the opposite. She had met the challenge head-on, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with calm certainty. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle the flight attendant. She had walked away quickly, her shoulders stiff, her face blank, but clearly rattled. It was the reaction of someone who had been so sure of her position, so certain she had the authority to correct, to scold, to put someone in their place, only to find herself on uncertain ground. She had made an assumption, and it had backfired. A few rows ahead, a businessman in a navy suit adjusted his tie and glanced toward Karoline. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps quiet agreement. A few seats away, a woman who had been scrolling through her phone now had it resting idly in her lap, her gaze flickering toward Karoline as if weighing whether to say something. The flight attendant was still in view, her movements sharp and brisk as she handed out drinks and adjusted trays. But every so often she stole quick glances in Karoline's direction, as if gauging whether or not she had made a mistake. The truth was, she had. She had expected compliance. What she had received instead was a response she hadn't anticipated, one that had forced her to reconsider whether she had overstepped. Karoline knew that kind of hesitation well. She had seen it before in people who had been so sure of themselves, so convinced that their way of thinking was the only acceptable one that they never stopped to consider they might be wrong. But the moment they were met with resistance, not anger, not hostility, just simple, unwavering confidence, everything shifted. She glanced toward the older woman beside her, who had been silent during the exchange, but now turned to her with a quiet smile. There was something knowing in her eyes, a kind of unspoken understanding. "That was impressive," the woman murmured, just loud enough for Karoline to hear. Karoline gave a small shrug. "It shouldn't have to be." The woman nodded, her smile fading slightly. "And yet here we are." Karoline knew what she meant. It wasn't just about this moment. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about something much bigger. The way faith, when openly displayed, was treated differently than other beliefs. The way people who prided themselves on tolerance so often seemed to have little of it, when it came to something they personally didn't agree with. The way the simplest expressions of belief, ones that should be unremarkable, had somehow become controversial. She could feel the weight of eyes on her still, the quiet murmur of passengers processing what they had just witnessed. Some seemed indifferent, their attention already shifting back to their own concerns. Others were thoughtful, perhaps recognizing something in this moment that they had seen elsewhere, in their own lives, in their own experiences. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to Karoline's row, this time holding a small plastic cup of water. Her grip on it was firm, but there was a stiffness in her movements, a kind of forced casualness that didn't quite mask the tension beneath the surface. She set the cup down on Karoline's tray table without making eye contact. "Here's your water," she said quickly, her voice noticeably softer than before. Karoline studied her for a brief moment, watching the way she avoided looking directly at her. It was a subtle but undeniable shift, one that spoke volumes. The confidence, The authority that had been so present earlier was now laced with uncertainty. It wasn't an apology, not directly, but it was a kind of retreat. Karoline picked up the cup, taking a small sip before setting it back down. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. The flight attendant nodded quickly, turning on her heel and moving away. As she disappeared down the aisle, Karoline exhaled, settling back into her seat. She hadn't needed to argue. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had simply refused to be pressured into hiding what she believed. And in doing so, she had made her point, without ever. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, the tension that had gripped the cabin earlier began to ease, but the moment still lingered in the air. Conversations that had paused during the exchange between Karoline and the flight attendant gradually resumed, the hum of voices and the occasional rustle of a turning magazine page filling the space. Yet, something had changed. Karoline sat comfortably in her seat, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her tray table. The cross around her neck rested against her collarbone, untouched, exactly where it had been all along. She hadn't adjusted it, hadn't hidden it, hadn't so much as glanced down at it in the wake of the confrontation. And yet, its presence was undeniable, not just to her, but to the people who had witnessed what had happened. She could feel the occasional glances from fellow passengers, some fleeting, some more deliberate. A few carried expressions of quiet support, while others seemed to be processing, perhaps questioning their own stance on what they had just observed. And then there were those who averted their eyes, pretending as if nothing had happened, as if ignoring it would make the moment disappear. The flight attendant hadn't returned to Karoline's row since she had set down the water. Instead, she moved swiftly through the cabin, tending to other passengers, her movement still sharp, but no longer carrying the same air of authority they had before. There was an unspoken understanding now. She had miscalculated, and she knew it. The irony of it all wasn't lost on Karoline. The entire incident had begun under the pretense of creating a welcoming environment, and yet, in attempting to enforce that idea, the flight attendant had done the exact opposite. Instead of fostering inclusivity, she had singled someone out, attempting to shame them into silence. And for what? A small personal symbol of faith? What had unfolded wasn't just about a necklace. It wasn't just about one person's discomfort. It was about something much deeper, about the quiet but persistent erosion of certain values, the expectation that some beliefs must be adjusted, dimmed, or hidden in order to accommodate an ever-shifting definition of tolerance. Karoline had seen this play out in different ways before. She had heard the stories: employees asked to remove religious symbols in the workplace, students discouraged from openly expressing their faith, people shamed for holding views that, just a few years ago, had been widely accepted. The pattern was always the same, a demand for acceptance that only went one way. But what people often underestimated was the power of quiet resistance. It didn't always take a loud protest or a heated debate to make a point. Sometimes the most effective response was simply refusing to be moved, standing firm in the face of pressure, and letting that strength speak for itself. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit leaned back in his seat, his gaze flickering toward Karoline for a brief moment before he gave a slight nod. It was subtle, but the message was clear. She wasn't the only one who had noticed. She wasn't the only one who understood. A few rows ahead, the woman who had earlier set her phone down turned her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. She was young, probably in her 20s, dressed in casual travel attire. Karoline could see the wheels turning in her mind, the internal dialogue playing out behind her eyes. Maybe she was rethinking something. Maybe she had never considered how quickly a moment like this could happen, how easy it was for someone to be told they needed to change, to blend in, to quiet themselves for the sake of someone else's comfort. The older woman seated next to Karoline shifted, clearing her throat softly. "You handled that well," she murmured, just loud enough for Karoline to hear. Karoline glanced at her, offering a small smile. "I didn't do much." "Oh, but you did," the woman said, her tone knowing. You didn't back down. Karoline considered that for a moment. She supposed, in a way, it was true. She hadn't set out to make a statement, hadn't planned for any of this to happen. And yet, by simply holding her ground, by refusing to apologize for something that didn't warrant an apology, she had ended up saying more than she ever could have with a long-winded argument. A few minutes later, the flight attendant made her way back down the aisle. This time, she didn't linger near Karoline's row. She kept her eyes forward, her focus on the passengers ahead, moving with the efficiency of someone trying to get through a task without drawing further attention to themselves. Karoline didn't expect an apology. She didn't need one. The shift in the woman's demeanor was enough to confirm that the message had been received. As the plane continued its journey, Karoline gazed out the window, the vast sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass. In the grand scheme of things, this was just one moment, one small exchange in a world filled with similar encounters. But it was a reminder of the importance of standing firm, of the quiet power in refusing to be swayed, of the truth that real tolerance isn't about silencing others, but about allowing everyone the freedom to be exactly who they are. As the flight continued smoothly through the sky, the tension that had once filled the cabin had all but disappeared. Conversations resumed, the soft rustling of pages turning in books, mixed with the occasional ding of the overhead signal, and most passengers seemed to settle back into their own thoughts. But despite the outward calm, the moment that had unfolded was not forgotten. Karoline sat with quiet confidence, her fingers occasionally brushing against the small cross around her neck. She had not wavered, not compromised, and certainly had not allowed herself to be intimidated. And in the end, that had made all the difference. There was no grand argument, no scene, no dramatic conclusion. Just a simple truth. Faith should never be something to be hidden or apologized for. It was not a weapon, nor was it a statement of superiority. It was personal, something deeply rooted in the hearts of those who carried it. Yet, in a world that increasingly demanded people conform to ever-changing social expectations, standing firm in belief had become a quiet act of defiance. Not because faith itself was controversial, but because it served as a reminder of tradition, of conviction, of principles that could not be so easily swayed by public opinion. As the flight attendant passed by again, her demeanor noticeably more reserved, Karoline didn't feel anger or resentment. If anything, she felt a quiet understanding. Perhaps the woman had not realized the weight of her words when she first spoke. Perhaps she had never been challenged in such a way before. But now, she had been. And in the end, it wasn't Karoline who had been shaken. The world had changed. Expressions of faith that had once been unremarkable were now scrutinized. People were told to be tolerant, but that tolerance often only extended one way. The expectation was clear: conform or be pressured into silence. But that day, Karoline had chosen not to be silent. She had chosen to simply exist as she always had, without apology, without justification. And in doing so, she had sent a message, far louder than any argument ever could, that faith is not something to be dictated by the shifting tides of societal approval. It is personal, unshaken, and unyielding. As the plane continued its journey, Karoline knew that this moment, though small, was part of something much bigger, a reminder that standing firm in one's beliefs is not about forcing them upon others. It's about refusing to be told that they must be hidden away. And as she looked out the window, the vast expanse of sky stretching endlessly before her, she smiled, because she knew she had done exactly what she was meant to do: stand strong without